Welcome to the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. Each week, government executives and thought leaders join me for an informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government and its effectiveness. These individuals are truly changing the way government does business. What are the key strategic priorities for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID? What is its digital strategy? And how is it expanding its engagement with the private sector to meet development mission outcomes? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Bonnie Glick, Deputy Administrator for USAID. My co-host from IBM is Josh Mandel. Take a look and take a listen. Download the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, and at businessofgovernment.org. So, Bonnie, would you give us an overview of the history and mission of the U.S. Agency for International Development, known as USAID?
Michael, I'd be delighted to. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, was established by President Kennedy in 1961, and he set it up with the recognition that it is our moral obligation as a wealthy nation to help countries that are much poorer than we are. Over time, over the last nearly 60 years, the U.S. Agency for International Development has evolved its focus to focus more on countries and their journeys to self-reliance. What do we do at USAID? We reduce the reach of conflict around the world so that conflicts that are breaking out, wherever those may be, impact the fewest number of people possible. We work very hard to prevent the spread of pandemic diseases. So one that we're seeing right now that we're seized with is the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We work to counteract the drivers of violence around the world that can lead to instability and can lead to some terrible transnational crimes, things like human trafficking. We work to promote American prosperity through market expansions to enable the export of U.S. products. We create a level playing field for U.S. businesses around the world, particularly in emerging market countries. We support stable, resilient, democratic societies. And we stand with people around the world to support nations when disasters strike or when crises emerge as the world's preeminent humanitarian assistance provider.
So how is it operationally, with such an important mission, how is USAID organized? What's your overall budget? Some of the facts around this.
Sure. It's useful to understand how USAID is set up. We are an independent agency of the U.S. government, and we are part of the President's National Security Council. The foreign assistance budget of the United States is around $40 billion annually, of which USAID holds the largest portion. We are the largest development agency in the world.
So what are your responsibilities as the Deputy Administrator?
That's a great question. The Deputy Administrator of USAID is the number 2 ranking person in the agency. I was nominated by President Trump and confirmed by the Senate to serve in this role. The deputy of most U.S. government agencies, with USAID not being all that different, is also the chief operating officer. So there's a big management component of the agency, managing the agency's budget, managing a staff of 11,000 people in around 100 different offices and USAID missions around the world. I work closely with the United States Interagency, part of the national security infrastructure, to craft the vision for foreign assistance around the world.
So, Bonnie, regarding your duties and responsibilities, what are your, I kind of always say 3 top management challenges, but what are your management challenges and how have you sought to address them?
The biggest challenge of any U.S. agency is our budget. We have to ensure that we are excellent stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. Every single day, I think, how is it that I am making sure that we are using taxpayer dollars, your dollars, my dollars, the audience dollars, in the most effective and efficient way possible? The way that I'm focusing on this is by looking at USAID somewhat through a business lens. So at USAID, the Agency for International Development, we talk about developing countries. In industry, you talk about emerging markets or growth markets. We at USAID talk about aid beneficiaries. IBM would talk about those same people as potential customers or clients. And I often say no mother wants to raise her child to be a refugee. Every mom wants her child to be a consumer. So looking at the best way to take U.S. budgeted dollars to focus on growth markets and emerging markets for potential future consumers is, I think, the best way to effectively, efficiently use taxpayer dollars to provide people around the world, too, with an additional margin of dignity in their daily lives. So budgeting is a challenge. In order to solve these problems, I want to engage with the private sector, both international corporations, American-based international corporations, but also local private sectors, because we want to make sure that programs that USAID funds and runs are sustainable. And likely the best way for a program or a project to remain sustainable is by having it run through a private sector lens, where there are benefits that accrue both to the investors, businesses, donors, as well as to the beneficiary community. Another big challenge that we have is in the area particularly of humanitarian assistance. The United States is the largest global bilateral donor of humanitarian assistance. The United States will always be there when countries face a disaster. But it's really important that others contribute to these humanitarian responses as well. So a large component of what we do is working with other international donors to ensure that there's appropriate burden sharing in the costs associated with humanitarian responses. And that, too, is a way of ensuring that we're good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. But I am going to say, Michael, the biggest challenge that we face, and it's a challenge that really presents itself in these developing countries, emerging markets, is that there is an attempt to foist other development models onto these countries, particularly when they are in a vulnerable place. And by that, I'm talking about the Chinese model of development. It's really not about development. It's about placing countries into debt traps that force them to give up national sovereignty. What do I mean by this? I'm just going to give you a concrete example of a Chinese so-called development project. China encouraged the government of Sri Lanka to finance a massive port through a Chinese program. By financing the port through China, Sri Lanka assumed that it would get a 21st century excellent port operation. It's an island country. Water commerce is critically important for the nation's sustainability. China financed the port for Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka assumed that there would be job creation for Sri Lankans. Instead, the port was built by Chinese laborers that were imported into Sri Lanka. There was probably some fine print on the contract that said that if Sri Lanka was unable to pay off the debt that China imposed, it would have to give up sovereignty over the port operations itself, including all associated profits, to the government of China, the Chinese Communist Party. Sri Lanka defaulted on the debt and lost control of this port. It is, in fact, a 21st century port. It was designed to receive 10,000 port calls a year. During the time that Sri Lanka held sovereignty, which was a short period, there were only 37 port calls. China built something for Sri Lanka that was not in the national interest of Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka ended up shouldering this tremendous debt that it was unable to repay and lost its own national control over its national port. So that is an enormous challenge that, as a responsible citizen of the world, I take very seriously, and I talk to developing country leaders about the importance of considering all aspects of development projects as they are presented, particularly large-scale infrastructure projects.
So, Bonnie, the world is undergoing an era of remarkable development progress, which you noted in the last segment, but it's also facing some emerging and increasingly complex challenges. And I want you to tell us more about USAID's policy framework. How does it represent the connective tissue between the notion and the actual work the agency does?
That is great because the USAID policy framework aims to bring the sort of ethereal academic approach to development into the real-world operational space in which USAID is operating around the world. In April of this year, USAID released what we're calling the policy framework, and it actually articulates the agency's approach to our mission, vision, and strategic orientation around what we refer to as a journey to self-reliance. The policy framework will allow us as USAID to be a better partner, strengthen our ability to accelerate development progress while meeting urgent humanitarian needs. And it makes USAID a more effective provider of foreign assistance on behalf of the American people. To capitalize on development gains and respond to complex challenges that present themselves in the new development landscape, we focus on what we're referring to as a journey to self-reliance. At the same time, we're transforming our organization with a single goal in mind, working to end the need for foreign assistance. Our development model is rooted in building self-reliance in each of the countries in which we operate. For USAID, this is an explicit pivot toward a much more country-centric, locally led, and data-driven approach to development assistance based on proven development best practices. Our model of assistance promotes balanced trade, open markets, democratic norms, and social inclusion. This means enabling locally led problem solving for enterprise-driven growth, inclusive societies, and transparent, accountable, citizen-responsive governance so that our partner countries have both the commitment and the capacity to solve their own development challenges. I'm going to distill that really quickly into what we mean by a journey to self-reliance, because this underpins everything that we're working to accomplish at USAID. We look at countries. Remember, we were talking earlier about developing countries versus emerging market countries, aid beneficiaries versus customers and clients. In order to reach that next stage, emerging or growth markets, clients and customers, a country needs to have everything in place for its citizenry and its nation state to be self-reliant. That doesn't mean not in receipt of foreign assistance, but it means in ownership of its own destiny, that a country can make decisions that are based on its own self-interest that will allow it eventually to eliminate the need for receipt of foreign assistance. Our goal ultimately, as I said, is to end the need around the world for foreign assistance. Of course, different countries are in different places along that journey to self-reliance. So there are countries that are at the beginning stages and countries that are closer to transitioning from an aid recipient country to a more partner-centered country, and even in many cases to being a donor country itself.
So, as a follow-up, I'd like to understand, maybe you could briefly identify AID's current key strategic priorities.
As you can probably guess from a journey to self-reliance, a major focus area for us is in private sector engagement. Mm-hmm. Having global and local private sectors engaged to build up a country to allow it to have sustainable growth over the long term. That is a key to self-reliance. We're also focused on women's economic empowerment and ultimately as well from the humanitarian side, maintaining a focus on the world's most vulnerable populations.
So, Bonnie, digital technology is transforming the way that people access information, goods, and services, and that certainly applies to the countries in which USAID operates. Would you tell us a little bit more about USAID's digital strategy, and how are you working to end the need for foreign assistance leveraging digital technology?
USAID's digital strategy will focus on USAID's long history of innovative digital development efforts. These include that USAID co-drafted and was the first official endorser of the Principles for Digital Development. It led a public outreach campaign which has resulted in the endorsement of over 100 organizations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank Group, Swedish aid, which is known as SIDA, and aid out of the UK, which is called DFID. USAID also co-founded something called the Better Than Cash Alliance, as well as the Alliance for Affordable Internet and the Digital Impact Alliance, which have been industry leaders. And we also launched something that we call the Women Connect Challenge. USAID has been at the forefront of fighting to close the digital gender divide. The potential for digital technologies and services to drive widespread economic growth, to improve health outcomes, and to lift millions of people out of poverty is clear. But significant barriers still remain, and the resulting gaps can slow global growth. They can increase a country's risk of instability, and they can help keep countries dependent on foreign assistance. Right now, for example, 4 billion people in developing countries do not have access to the internet, and 1.7 billion women still lack access to a mobile phone. At the same time, digitally enabled disinformation campaigns and emerging cybersecurity risks can further threaten stability and introduce violent conflict. So it's important as an agency that we look at ways to foster digital self-reliance as part of the journey to self-reliance.
So as a follow-up to that, is there a digital pathway to self-reliance? I mean, what is being done to build that pathway?
Connectivity delivered through wireless telecommunications networks is critical for development. Countries with strong digital ecosystems foster more self-reliant and resilient societies, which in turn invest in their own infrastructure. It's a virtuous cycle. USAID plays a critical role in increasing the effective and responsible use of digital development and also creates a runway for the private sector to drive long-term growth. This is sustainable, and it makes for an excellent investment in open, interoperable, inclusive, and secure Internet, all of which are critical to maximizing the positive values of the Internet. Through our commitments to digital programming, we can measure how technology and services help individuals experience economic empowerment and financial inclusion. It also advances a country's national security, and it supports accountability and transparency in governance. So it's hard for me to think of a better way to lead toward self-reliance than along a digital pathway.
So, Bonnie, you've mentioned a couple of times the change in culture and approach to development that you're taking. It's the private sector engagement policy I really want to elaborate on. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. USAID is undertaking a major cultural and operational transformation to expand our engagement with the private sector. This will help us achieve outcomes of shared interest and shared value. One of the things that we focus on is open markets. Open markets send signals to investors, both internal investors in a country and foreign direct investment investors. The private sector we view as the most significant force in history for lifting human lives out of poverty. We're looking at ways to move countries from being foreign assistance recipient nations to foreign direct investment recipient nations.
Perfect. So as a follow-up, I was wondering if you could highlight some of the successes related to this engagement. What's next in the area as well?
So one of the most exciting developments in the past year was the passage of the BUILD Act in Congress. The BUILD Act led to the creation of the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Shorthand is DFC. The new Development Finance Corporation, DFC, will combine all of the existing loan and loan portfolio guarantees that USAID has had historically through our Development Credit Authority. Our Development Credit Authority will be augmented with political risk insurance, loans, and loan guarantee products from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which was called OPIC. The new DFC, then, as you can see, is a blend of OPIC and some of USAID's assets that will also have the authority to make direct equity investments in projects. We're looking forward to working closely with the DFC to use its expanded set of potential tools so that we can directly support even more market-driven, private sector-led solutions at a larger scale than ever before. One great illustrative example is something that our team put together last year with USAID's Land and Urban Office. It's a new program to address the widespread problem of plastics in the ocean. USAID provided support to an entity called the Ocean Fund with a loan portfolio guarantee. Our guarantee enabled the fund manager, Circulate Capital, to raise up to $35 million from key private sector actors to invest in companies all along the plastics recycling value chain. So investors that came out of our small loan portfolio guarantee, investors include PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, Dow, Danone, Unilever, and Coca-Cola. Borrowers under the guarantee will be private sector enterprises that work in either the collection, sorting, recycling, or manufacturing parts of chains throughout South and Southeast Asia. The result is projected to bring significant market-based private sector-led improvements in the overall recycling value chain and reduce plastic waste flowing into the world's oceans.
Be sure to join me next time on the Business of Government Hour TV for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government and its effectiveness. Until then, it's businessofgovernment.org.